Yeah, and I think it's very important to point out that until around 1950, right, and the Korean War, as you point out, Amanda, none of this real legal framework existed for this transnational or international adoption complex to actually be a complex, right? Because I think when we hear the word complex, we think of like an organized organization between both NGOs, as Andrew mentions, governments, individuals, and other organizations. At least there's some structure there, right? But before 1950, really, there wasn't much of anything. And even after and during the Korean War, there were the adoptions that happened between, largely American servicemen and women, military service people, and they were one-off or very pointedly specific actions that were allowed. I think when we start thinking about the actual sort of complex happening, I think as Andrew has mentioned, the the Christian organizations really come in to the fore. The Holt organization, the Holts are actual people, and almost I think a large number of these organizations, Spence Chapin, I believe, which was the one that I was adopted through, but Holt is like the main one. Most of them are affiliated in some way or another with white Christianity in America, right?
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, you're right. So Western, like Christian missionaries, they arrived in Korea around like the 19th century, and they were the ones that really like laid the foundation for this adoption process and this adoption like industry. So before the missionaries arrived, if like Korean kids were orphaned by their parents, they would just be taken in by other family members, or they would become like servants to like other families. But it was these Western Christian missionaries which decided to set up these orphanages for kids that had lost their parents, and they established more of a standardized form of care for these orphans, and that's where that sort of adoption industry emerged from. So you mentioned Harry Holt, who he was like one of these people who like really drove the institutionalization of Korean adoption. So I was wondering, like, could you expound a little bit on like who he was and like what he did in terms of like creating this industry?
So I myself was a Holt baby, so I speak from experience. The case of the Holts is really interesting because they were missionaries, but they weren't in Korea when they started, and they did lead to the institutionalization of Korean adoption in a sort of very deinstitutionalized way. So after the Korean War, the Holts were living their lives in Oregon as evangelical Christians, and they came across a newspaper clipping of all these abandoned kids, these war orphans from the Korean War. And these were almost exclusively mixed race kids from Korean women who had survival sex or were assaulted by US and UN troops. So there's all these mixed race war babies, and there's a newspaper article showing their plight. And the Holts think, we have to do something. So they fly to Korea, look at the orphans, come back and start lobbying Congress to pass a law to allow babies to be mass imported from South Korea. They're successful. The first plane flight lands in Portland, Oregon.
Once again, an orphan airlift touches down at Portland, bringing a group of 24 Korean-American war waifs for adoption into American homes. The man responsible for these heartwarming scenes is Harry Holt of Cresswell, Oregon. His third trip from Korea brings the total to 76. On his first trip last year, he brought 8 youngsters, which he and Mrs. Holt themselves adopted. Since then, he has arranged for homes for all the other homeless waifs of mixed Korean and American blood, which makes Mr. Holt something of a record godfather. Big-hearted Harry Holt continues his kindly work.
The thing is, the Holts just wanted to get babies to families in the U.S. So they did almost no background checks on the adoptive families. The only thing they checked was their income level to be able to support a kid. So when that first plane touches down, a representative from the Bureau of Indian Affairs is on the ground. Another organization that doesn't have a great track record with regards to transracial adoptions. And Bureau of Indian Affairs guy is horrified by how little oversight there is. And he writes this scathing report about the lack of accountability for the way that Holt is distributing these orphan kids.
Yeah. So what's interesting about the Holts, I mean, there's a lot of interesting things about the Holts, but I was reading up on them a little for research for this episode. But I found out that they would literally send charter planes back from Korea, to South Korea, to the US, just full of Korean orphans. And their main priority was getting as many children back to the US as quickly as possible. And that was prioritized over appropriate matching to suitable parents. And they also ran their orphanages in South Korea with kind of a missionary zeal, right? The way that the orphanages were set up they were set up to teach the kids how to assimilate to white Western culture as quickly as possible. So they would eat in these American style cafeterias and eat American style food and use forks to eat their foods. And so they were sort of at a very early age indoctrinated into a middle-class white American Christian values and ideology. But I feel like we can't really talk about, how the Holts could have managed to set up this organization without talking about, the role that, the U.S. occupation and the Korean War played. So I'm wondering, could you talk a little bit about, how transnational adoption sort of arose in Korea as a response to U.S. war, or the Korean War, and then the U.S. occupation before that.
Yeah, I think the thing about the Korean War is the U.S. literally didn't get anything out of it. Which is why Americans love to call it the Forgotten War, which I have some feelings about. But anyway, I think I'm unclear to what extent this was a conscious project by U.S. state elites, but I think it definitely worked out in their favor that they allowed it to keep happening. But there was a sort of propaganda coup at the end of the war, which again accomplished nothing except getting rid of a whole lot of napalm on civilians by having this image of these children who were abandoned by their parents, who were abandoned by their country, which was too destitute to take care of them for reasons we have nothing to do with. And then normal American families took these children in. We didn't just take them in as a country, we took them into our homes and made them Americans too. I think that there was something really powerful in that image, for the U.S. state, for nonprofits like the Holt organization that moved into that space and helped to establish it, as well as for adoptive parents and potential adoptive parents. There's this case of someone who, this white person saw one of these ads. There were ads for us, ads for Korean babies. And she like circled the baby she wanted and mailed it in. And I was like, I want this baby. And they wrote her back and was like, this child actually is a family. And then she wrote them back and was like, but I want that baby. There was something very compelling to folks, for better or for worse, about these images and about being able to play this role. And I mean, that's really one of the lasting effects of the Korean War in the United States. It hasn't really had a lasting effect on how people think about the United States or U.S. military power, sort of sandwiched between World War II and Vietnam. Most of the people who fought in that war have been dead for a while. It hasn't had an impact, seemingly, on the trajectory of the United States moving forward. I think one of the biggest legacies of that war within the U.S. is that there are now 20,000 or 200,000 Korean adoptees who have come here, which is the size of Salt Lake City. A Salt Lake City of Korean adoptees. And I think that's one of the ways that depoliticizing adoption is so nefarious, because it doesn't look at the population transfer of Salt Lake City from one country to another after a devastating war as political.
Right, and it continued happening well past the population of the war children, right? It kept going on. It's like, okay, well, now it's 1970, it's 1980. None of these kids are born from the war, and
right, because in other countries, they would like adopt out kids to the U.S. for a while, and then at a certain point they stopped. But with Korea, like long after their war with Japan, long after the U.S. occupation, long after the Korean War, they're still continuing to adopt out kids.
Right, and to be fair, I guess, to Korea, they had the numbers have fallen very way down, and it started going down since the mid to late 80s. So they have because at some point it looked bad when a country that has to its credit come very far from the devastation of that period of Japanese occupation, American occupation, and so a very bad period of decades, to become very, very economically powerful. It begins to not look good on you that you're continuing to export children across the world, not just the United States, but to European countries as well. I think you bring up a great point, Andrew, that I think it's important to remember that the Korean War happened almost immediately following the end of World War II, and almost marked the beginning of sorts of the Cold War and the ideological battle between democracy and capitalism, for the first world, right, of America and its allies, and against communism and the second world, or the Russia and China. And so any sort of way to turn more armed conflict to the U.S. advantage through saying, look, we're rescuing these children, it only served to help the growing American empire, and it's continued on. Right, we see that this is the beginning of the international adoption complex, and it's people are being, it was an example of what happened, and we saw it happening in Vietnam, right? And it sort of was like a playbook that I think kept
Yeah.
repeating, right?